Hello. Sometimes I think the odd experience of me making YouTube videos and you watching them is somewhat similar to the strange experience of an author writing a book for an anonymous reader. I mean, here I am speaking in a very intimate way with you, even though I don't know who you are. You're just this other person that I'm speaking to in this way. And in the same way, the author is writing a book for a presumed reader, even though they don't know who that reader is going to be. And it raises all these stranger questions about, like, well, who is the narrative voice in this, and who is that narrative voice speaking to? Where does that narrative voice come from? Just as I start to have all these like bizarre and disturbing existential questions about if I'm speaking in this way, who am I? Who am I speaking to you? But these are like questions which are like quite appropriate to this quite extraordinary and really unique novel that I just read, which I think is unlike anything else I've read recently or that I can think of at all, because the narrative voice in this is so odd in that it moves in and out of different characters and points of view very freely, and from third person to second person to first person. And so you get all these different perspectives, and it switches between them so freely and in a way which is so beautiful in a way too, which is freeing in a quite extraordinary way. And it seems like it shouldn't work, like this kind of narrative shouldn't work, but it does oddly work in the way that Damon Galgut has written it in this novel, The Promise. And I think that's so special. And though I don't know if I entirely agree with this book, I'm still sort of thinking of how I feel about it, and whether it does actually entirely work. And so I just wanted to come on here and have a discussion about it in case you read it, or you're thinking about reading it, or if you haven't read it and you want to come back after you have read it and then have a chat about it. It'd be really lovely to have a discussion about it, because yeah, it's so special what this novel does, and it really caught me off guard. And I think it is really purposeful in that the way he structures it says something much bigger. It's making a message in itself in how he's written it, and has done so very purposefully. So this novel concerns a family called the Swarts. They're a white South African family, and it follows them over many years and decades, both before and after apartheid. And you follow their stories, like not through necessarily their lives, but through their deaths. And it follows the stories of 4 different funerals in the family and focuses on their lives in the time surrounding the funerals, like leading up to the funeral, and then the process of the funeral and after the funeral. And that seems quite bleak in a way. And there's a lot about this book is quite bleak, and even more so, I think, when you think about the larger message of the book. And what really disturbed me so much about this is not so much that kind of dark story matter, but as it started to get into the story and you saw these representations of different characters. Like it starts off with the mother Rachel, who is dying, and you follow her young daughter Amor as she's sort of wandering around their property. They live in this farmhouse, and they're fairly well to do. They have a lot of land, and Amor is wandering. This 13-year-old girl is wandering around the property, and she comes across a boy who is the son of a long-standing maid on the property, who's helped raise the children and who's cared for the mother in her time of death. And she has this interaction with him, and you realize that he's defined as a black boy, as opposed to she is a white girl, and she notices his smell and his body odor, and the way it writes about that, I started to feel very uncomfortable because this representation of smell and when you think about like oppositions and how George Orwell wrote about the thing, the horrible conception about poor people is that they smell, and it's this kind of stigma which is attached to a certain category of people. And if you're beginning a story and introducing a character like that, who is consciously defined as black, then that starts to feel quite problematic and uncomfortable. But as the story went on, I started to realize that the author wants you to feel uncomfortable like that because you're entirely in the perspective of this white family, and you're seeing all of their experiences, and they're often quite like self-consumed and self-obsessed experiences filtered through this white perspective, and how you're entirely locked in this point of view. And it makes you realize that they're tragically locked in this point of view, and they express throughout the book a number of different racist and horrible attitudes, and it does make for quite uncomfortable reading, but it's quite confrontational in that way, I think, in how it's making you really locked inside this perspective and seeing how these characters can't escape it. And so the thing about the beginning of this novel is that it begins with the mother dying, and because her black maid Salome has cared for her so much, she wants to leave to Salome the house. She lives in a sort of annex on the property with her son, and she wants to leave this annex to Salome, and makes her husband promise to give this annex to Salome, and the husband agrees to this, and Amor, the 13-year-old's daughter, witnesses this promise being made, and then the mother dies and the promise isn't fulfilled, and the years go by, and Amor wants the promise to be fulfilled. She keeps reminding her family about this, that that Salome was supposed to inherit this house, and the transfer is just not made year after year, and there's real resentment and tragedy to that, and this kind of plot is directly taken from the novel Howard's End by E.M. Forster, which has the same plot line in a house that was bequeathed to someone, and the family that technically inherits the house on paper doesn't want to surrender this property, and so it's about how this house isn't given over time, and the consequences of that, and I know that Damon Galgut was inspired by this because his previous novel was called Arctic Summer, and he published it several years ago, so it's been quite a while since his next novel, and I don't actually have a copy of Arctic Summer, which is awful because I loved that novel so much. It's a brilliant novel where he fictionalizes the life of E.M. Forster, and it's so moving how he follows his story and his somewhat suppressed sexuality and his difficult experiences with his mother, and following his life. I thought that novel was so moving and fascinating. I must have lent it out to somebody, and if I lent it out to you, please give it back to me, because I need to buy another copy of that novel to have it on my shelf, because it's such a great novel. But yeah, obviously Galgut is a fan of Forster, or really inspired by his work, and so yeah, I think Howard's End is a direct influence on this novel, but he takes that and he does something quite different with it and makes it very specific to the experience of South Africa in the way I described in showing this family over time. And I would get some quite frustrated at some points in that I really wanted to know more about Salome's life and some more about these characters' lives, and but you are denied that. You're not allowed to see that, and that's because of this white family, which really isn't considering her, definitely not her inner life, but not her life in general, just like how she's getting on. You get these little snapshots of her where she's sort of in the background as these different funerals are taking place over the year, and the characters will make these sort of comments about her and be very dismissive about her, and you're denied access to that. And yeah, I think that's really powerful, the cumulative effect of it over the course of the novel. But it's so curious and strange because the point of view is so amorphous, I guess you could call it, in that it moves and through these different perspectives and points of view. Because sometimes you do get little snapshots inside the perspective or the lives of some black characters. Like there's a black chauffeur for the family, and at one point it's referred how this chauffeur isn't able to please two white people at the same time because they might have two different points of view, and they're demanding that he agree with both of their points of view. And so there's no way to win in that argument. And then in another point, a car is hijacked and a character is murdered by a black character that steals from this character, and you get a little snapshot of this thief's life and his position and why he's in this position and driven to this position and making these robberies and killing people, and it's not really affecting his conscience, and so you do get small perspectives every once in a while, but yeah, not of Salome and her life. And at one point towards the end of the novel, the narrator makes this very confrontational statement where the narrator says, "If Salome's home hasn't been mentioned before, it's because you have not asked. You didn't care to know." And that's almost too confrontational. It feels like as a reader, you feel like you're really being accused of not thinking about these things, and I don't want to be like defensive and say like, oh, but I was thinking about these things, because I think it's more directed to the family in this novel and how the family really didn't consider that point of view. But it's interesting because it's up for interpretation, a lot of these things of how the narrative voice flits in and out of these different perspectives and points of view and ways of showing time. Like sometimes time is really stretched out and you get these really minute details about time, and at other times time sort of switches about and it will describe how like a lot of time has gone by, and I'm not really sure how much, but it's quite a lot, and so yeah, it's so interesting in that way. And but this scene in this statement that's made in the novel reminds me of this quite it seems like a weird comparison to make, but it reminds me of this melodramatic movie from I think it's the late 1950s that it came out, which is Imitation of Life, directed by Douglas Sirk. And in this movie, there's a white character named Laura who takes in a black woman named Annie, who has a mixed race daughter, and her daughter has very light skin and wants to be perceived as white. And that's the main conflict and drama of the film. But towards the end of the film, when Annie, who's worked as a maid for Laura throughout the entire film, she dies, and there's this enormous stately funeral for her. And Annie has only been this sort of character in the background working as a maid, and you don't really get any perspective on her inner life or what's happening in her life other than what's to do with the conflict of her daughter and her daughter wanting to pass as white. And then you get this big scene of a stately funeral, and Laura comes out of the church and sees all the people waiting around the coffin to pay tribute to Annie. And it's almost like she's shocked and realized how much of a life Annie has had, and that's because she's been so consumed with like her own dramas in her life. She hasn't really considered so much what's going on in Annie's life. And I think what's so radical about this film is not so much the melodramatic story of it, although that's quite absorbing, but the way the film and the director, I guess, is confronting the viewer and saying, well, you probably never thought about this character's fuller life, other than just being a maid in the background. And what does that say about our assumptions, and what does that say about how much we care about and think about other people's lives? And so I think Damon Galgut is doing a similar thing in this novel, where he's trying to confront the reader as well as this issue, and ask this very serious question, and ask the perceptions and assumptions we make about other people's lives, and how much integrity we allow to give to other people, not necessarily just of like different races, but of different classes and all these different levels of society. And we obviously ascribe more importance to certain people than others. And so I think he is asking these larger questions, but because the narrative is so odd, I think it leaves a lot of ambiguity, and it can lead to some misinterpretation. So I've seen some people who've read this novel have been so frustrated by it, and because it is so limited in its perspective. But I think it is quite clearly intentionally done that way, and it's very powerful for doing that. And so yeah, I think it is such a unique novel, and so the story itself, as it follows the stories of these different characters, you become absorbed in their life, because in a way they're quite awful people in different ways, and though I found myself really hungering for Salome's perspective, but also for Amore's life, to know more about her life, which we're sort of denied, because at a young age she realizes the state of her family and the state of our country. So what do? You can't completely change and overhaul the country. You can try to make little incremental changes in your own way in the choices you make, and but you can't completely overhaul it. So she removes herself from the family. So throughout a lot of the novel, she's just this kind of very removed figure in the background, and you get these small details about her life, that she trains as a nurse, and she works with AIDS patients, and she for a while she has a long-term female lover, and then for a while she has a male lover, and so you get these little glimpses, but you don't really get so much about her interior life and thoughts and processes, other than when she arrives back to the family homestead for a funeral and reminds everyone, this house was meant to be left for Salome, and so I think it's quite powerful in that way, and that you're also denied her story, because I would love a novel all about her point of view. But again, what we get instead is these more like distasteful characters, who aren't entirely unsympathetic. I mean, they have certain qualities to them which are just sort of human foibles, which everyone can relate to. Like, there's a whole bit about sort of body issues and being ashamed of your body, and how the narrative says quite directly, like I'm sure you can relate to that as well, and I can certainly relate to that of being stressed out about how my body looks, and so yeah, there are these little touches of that, but then they come out with these statements which are horribly racist, and which are really distancing, and make me really despise them, and so in a way it's almost satisfying to see that rather than a family going through the generations and being continued on. This is the compression and the end of a family line, and because you follow funeral after funeral in this story, and in a way that's almost like weirdly hopeful, in that hopefully this point of view is dying in South Africa, and it's sort of changing the point of view. And it's another issue that makes me slightly worry about the message of this novel, because I wonder how much does this really represent South Africa, and how much should it have to really represent South Africa, I mean, as it's like lived today and as people experience it today. And it's something I grow slightly wary of when reading books that are from other countries and set in other countries, and that I love reading about other experiences and can be suddenly immersed in a country, in a life, and a culture that is across the world from mine. But at the same time, I sort of worry, like, how much does that really represent the people that it comes out of? How much is it a sort of projection or kind of export from that country, a kind of cultural export of what foreign readers want to read about that country? And so I wonder, how much does this really relate to the current South Africa? Though I think it has to in some ways, because I had this experience several years ago where I was overhearing a conversation between two men that were talking about the kind of people that they fancy and desire. And one of the men had recently arrived in England from South Africa, and he was white, and he was talking about how he really doesn't fancy black women because their hygiene isn't as good, and I was completely gobsmacked, like, listening to this. Like, do you really believe that? That is, that's sort of connecting back to that initial feeling I had at the beginning of this novel, of this massive stereotype and really demeaning, horrible way of characterizing a whole group of people, and a way of dismissing them in a way by using this sort of sensory experience of that it's so repugnant to me, that attitude. And so it was really shocking to hear that, and I feel like, well, some South Africans must feel that way. Probably not, definitely not all of them. But some people do still feel this way, and so I think this novel does still probably have some relevancy in that way. I mean, if you're from South Africa, or if you've read a lot of South African literature, maybe you can let me know in the comments below, and we can have a discussion about it, because I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, I've been thinking about this issue because I've been communicating through email with a reader in the Caribbean, and talking about current Caribbean literature and representations of the Caribbean in current Caribbean literature, and the legacy of colonialism, and how that's represented, and does that really represent the current lives of Caribbeans, or is this something that foreign readers just want to read about because that's how they characterize that country? And so yeah, it's these larger issues that I've been thinking about and contemplating, and this novel definitely made me think about those a lot more. But it's a completely absorbing story, and like I said, even though it feels like the narrative shouldn't work, it really did work for me. I was quite bewitched by how it moves so freely, like, not just through perspectives of the living characters, but also through some of the dead characters, and goes into these kind of spiritual realms, but also in the sort of false spirituality. Like, there's a very funny scene where characters try to go to this kind of seance to try to speak to a character that's died, and it's just sort of shown as this kind of ridiculous facade. So yeah, there are some scenes of it which are quite humorous, kind of like slightly at the character's expense, and that's another thing that it feels quite right to laugh at them sometimes, because their attitudes are so horrible. But then it makes me worry about an authorial voice that's so judgmental that it's not having enough compassion for its characters. And so yeah, it's raising a lot of these issues for me. And so I think it's such an intriguing novel, and there's so much to say about it. And yeah, and so I'm looking forward to having more discussions with people about it. This is a novel that's only just been published here in the UK. I'm not sure where it's come out other places, but yeah, and it's quite curious about this cover and how I was initially like, oh, that's not a very nice cover, but I think it is quite interesting how it shows on the cover of, you get this very confrontational stare of a girl in it, like the character of Amor in the novel, and how she is not going to let this issue go about the promise which is made, which is the central premise of this story, and so I think that does sort of work, and also with the pages turning, that this is a work of fiction, and you're kind of conscious throughout of it that you're reading this work of fiction, and there's this narrator voice behind the story being told, which you are aware of and which has a definite point of view, and which is locking you in the point of view of this white family, and I think that's quite extraordinary. So yeah, let me know in the comments below if you've read this, if you want to discuss any of the issues I've raised, or if you have any other points about the book you want to raise, or just whether you liked it or didn't like it, or if you're interested in reading it now, or if you're not interested in reading it now, or if you have any other suggestions for other good new South African literature, because I don't read all that much new South African literature, and I think not all that much is published in the UK here. So yeah, I would like to read more. But yeah, I think Damon Galgut is such a fascinating writer. I've read a few of his books, and again, yeah, I've felt ambivalent about some of them, but I would definitely recommend his novel Arctic Summer, because I think that is brilliant. So I'm going to stop rambling now and going on and talking to you, whoever you are, and go back to my own little weird private existence in my head, and back to reading, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.